So now we are going to start this very important webinar session, the webinar workshop on masterclass on teaching research. Good evening, everybody. I warmly welcome all the lecturers and postgraduate students from different universities. University of Jawaharlal and CSAM University of Jaffna and University of Ruhuna and University of Colombo and University of Catalonia and University of Viable. There were some representative. I welcome on behalf of the Faculty of Management, Social Sciences and Humanities at the Sir John Putalavala Defence Academy in Sri Lanka. So this is simply called KDU. KDU is the world ranking defense university in Sri Lanka and equally good for management studies, social sciences and humanities, law, medical sciences, engineering, IT and postgraduate studies. Major General Milinda Peris is the current Vice Chancellor of the university. According to his vision, he wants to build up good relationship with universities in Sri Lanka and also worldwide. Therefore, we are encouraged to organize this kind of academic session, particularly for the benefit of local universities. This webinar, organized in collaboration with the Queensland Business School in Australia, under the title of Masterclass on Teaching Research. This webinar is specially for academics, PhD and master students, and upcoming researchers of the local universities. The main purpose of this webinar is to enhance the research skills of our novice and emerging researchers of the Sri Lankan universities. As you all know, that this webinar is done by the Professor Robert Puff. You are welcome for the session, Robert. And before moving into you, I must say something about you. The Professor Robert is a world-class researcher in finance at the Queensland Business School, University of Queensland in Australia. He published many books, book chapters, and more than 300 research articles in high-impact, indexed, and high-ranking journals such as Journal of Banking and Finance, Australian Journal of Management, Journal of Empirical Finance, Journal of Business Finance and Accounting, Pacific Basin Finance Journal, and Journal of Finance Research. Robert is the editor-in-chief of Pacific Basin Finance Journal, formerly editor of the Accounting and Finance up to 2011, associate editor of several leading journals, including Australian Journal of Management. Once we look at his Google citation, it's very impressive. His total citation is 15,884, and he maintained his H index 63. It's very impressive, Professor Robert. And Robert has supervised nearly 40 PhD students successfully and examined 50 PhD dissertations. Building on 35-year academic career, his latest focus is pitching research. Today, we are going to talk about his latest career, the pitching research. He has plenty of experience in the field of finance, particularly the research, and using his research career and experiences, he built up a certain framework. Today, we are going to talk about that. This is time for you, Robert, so you can continue from here.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor Wasantha. I really appreciate your invitation and your hard work. Without you and your encouragement, we wouldn't be here this evening, and I'm very happy to help out in whatever way I can. I'd just like to extend my gratitude also to the Faculty of Management, Social Sciences and Humanities, KDU as well. I know you've stressed that they've been very supportive of you, and I'm very appreciative of their support for you, because without their support, we wouldn't be here tonight. So I'm now going to move to share my screen. And if I do this correctly, we will see my slides. So just bear with me. And I believe now you will see a big purple slide filling your screen. Masterclass of Pitching Research, Sri Lanka. So what is this all about? Well, in terms of the pre-reading, I guess, we were recommending that all of the participants have a read of the SSRN paper, Pitching Research. And I guess several of you have done that, and some of you haven't. What I would urge you to do is that at some stage in the coming days or weeks, that you might access the paper and have a close look at it. It's a resource. Treat it as a resource, something that you can have and store and save and refer to as and when that you need. Tonight we will have a detailed discussion of it, but there is much, much more than we can ever talk about in a session like this. So it's really important for you to take the opportunity of having the paper itself. There are 3 goals of the masterclass. The most important goal is really just to explain the framework and the underlying philosophy. And this will take a good portion of the time that we have this evening. Now, a little bit later on, I will pause and see whether there are any questions. It's always good to have questions because I can never quite anticipate what might be troubling you, what is something that you don't quite understand or you're confused by. So it's important that you take the opportunity to ask those questions, and I will do my best to answer them. The second goal will be to, I think, look at one example, and if all goes well with the technology, I'm hoping this example will be a video, a short video of about 9 minutes. So in fact, I'm hoping to share with you 2 videos. The first one will be an animation, and that will take place in Goal 1, explaining the framework. And then the second video, also of about 9 minutes, will be a videoed example of a PhD student at the University of Queensland. And I'll say some more about that when we get closer to the time. Now, the slides, which I will send across to Asantha to share with whoever wishes to have them. The slides have a number of slide pages at the end where you can get access to helpful resources. I'll make a brief comment about that later, but a lot of it is self-explanatory in terms of what resources are available. So let's move to Goal 1. What is the framework and what's the underlying philosophy? Well, my favorite way of introducing this is to share with you a cartoon that I borrowed from quite a famous website. It's phdcomics.com. And I think worldwide, a lot of PhD students will, from time to time, visit this site because it gives them a moment of relief. There's relief in terms of some humor that is very relevant to their experience. And the example that I have on the screen now is a great example of this, and it's very relevant to the topic of today's session. And what we see in this 3-cell cartoon is a professor. The professor is in each of the slides. The professor is wearing a delightful green vest, a red tie. He has a beard. And I think of this professor as what I might have looked like at certain stages in my career. Not right now, I don't have a beard, but I have had a beard in the past. And what's happening is really the professor getting prepared for a meeting with one of his research students. And we see in the first cell of this cartoon the back of the student. Now, the student has sent to the professor a load of material. And what the student is hoping is to get a lot of guidance and feedback from the professor. And the student asks, "Sir, did you read the draft I left on your desk?" And the professor answers, "I've looked at it." Now, the second and third cell of the cartoon indicate two alternative scenarios for what "I've looked at it" really means. Now, the second cell, the middle cell of the cartoon, is what the student hopes it means. Because in that cell, there I am reading through in great detail every page. I'm reading every page, I'm reading every paragraph, I'm reading every sentence, and I'm thinking about every word. And we can see that as a bonus, I say, "This is amazing." Now, there are a lot of pages there, many pages, and one could imagine that if I do that job very carefully, this will take me a long, long time, maybe an hour, 2 hours, maybe even more. Now, the reality is that professors don't have that time. So that is not likely to happen. What is likely to happen? It's depicted in the final and third cell. And you can see that the professor is not actually looking at any pages, any paragraphs, any words. All the professor is doing is looking from a distance. And that's what "I've looked at it" may well mean. Now, that indicates a problem. That indicates a meeting that will be a failure. The meeting will fail because the professor has not been able to absorb the material. And a big reason for this, it's not the only reason, is there is too much. Too much is being delivered, and very likely it's being delivered in a way that is all over the place. So this is not going to be a very happy meeting for either the student or the professor. And so a theme that I'd like us to build on in this session is around communication. And communication is important. Communication is very important, and it can fail. And that cartoon is telling us a situation where a research student, desperate for feedback, desperate for advice, will walk away disappointed. Why? Because they haven't been able to communicate in a way that will work. And they've fallen for the big trap of providing too many pages and in a way that is not inviting for the professor to read. So what's the solution? Well, that is where I want to take us with this pitching research masterclass. It's not the only solution, but it's the one that I want to tell you about because I think it's a very good solution. And it's a solution that allows a research student that's very new, that's struggling with this new field, struggling with the language of academia, to better communicate to an academic expert. It's an incredibly difficult task, and this framework is designed to make it easier. Now, why does this work? Well, for me, in terms of coming up with this framework, the sort of principles I had in mind that I thought would be beneficial and valuable are listed on this slide. So it's a structured tool, and we'll see that structure very soon. It emphasizes brevity, so it's important to be brief. And as much as possible, it's trying to be simple, okay? And that will come about because of the structure that tries to lay out a plan, a simple framework that if used well, will allow a methodical approach, will allow us to convey in a clear way and in a focused way the essential information that a supervisor or a professor, the information they would require in order to give good advice, good feedback in a very short meeting. So the meetings I often think of are 30-minute meetings. And so this framework will allow success in that setting. So what I'm going to do now is play you a video that spells out the framework, because at the moment I've talked about it in an abstract way, and if you haven't done the pre-reading, you will have no clue what it's about. So in order to do this, I'm going to momentarily stop sharing the slides. I'm going to find the correct video. I'm going to reshare.
Hi, I'm Robert Pfaff, Professor of Finance at the University of Queensland Business School. You'll come to know me as the Pitch Doctor. Researchers make systematic and rigorous inquiry into things. It is immensely rewarding and important work, but definitely not easy. New researchers often have trouble getting started and maintaining focus in a sea of information. Supervisors are there to help, but their time is limited. Wouldn't it be great to have a systematic method for keeping yourself on track and getting the most out of the time you have with your supervisor? The pitch template is designed to distill your idea down to the key elements, making it easier to first clarify your own thinking and then to communicate to others. Identifying and articulating the essential details helps to start a conversation, allowing you and your supervisor to get the most out of the research process. You can also use the pitch template as a way to quickly deconstruct and record the important elements of research articles you are reading. Using the pitch template to reverse engineer the research of others will give you excellent knowledge of the leading approaches in your field. The pitch template is a living document that can and should be updated as you hone your ideas. It is designed to shape your thinking around what is most important and guide you from initial stages to final write-up. Let's take a look at the key areas of your research that are identified and outlined in the pitch template. What is the pitch template? First, your project needs a meaningful classification. Start by providing a working title and some key information on the research problem and background. Your working title will probably change over the life of the project. To start with, think short, 8 words or less, and informative. You can make it seductive and searchable later on. Next, you need a key research question, the overarching question that guides the research. When you're framing your research question, try asking yourself these questions. What is your overarching discipline? Is it finance, marketing, etc.? Start at the top and funnel down through smaller and smaller sub-disciplines to position your problem within a precise area. What is your paradigm? What is the broad field you are positioning your problem in? That is, the philosophical perspective. And what are the underlying assumptions and language required for this paradigm? What is your focus? Are you pursuing a descriptive, predictive, or analytical approach? In the next section of the template, you identify key research papers. Choose the 3 key articles that have most helped you clarify your thinking. These may change across the course of your research project, but it is important to always have an understanding of how you plan to fit your research into the broader literature. Next comes motivation. In this section, you explain what are the scholarly factors driving your study. Motivation can come from real-world phenomena, the requirement for a new theory or model, or stakeholder needs. How should I organise my research thoughts? It's as easy as 3, 2, 1. Now that you have defined and positioned your research problem, you need to focus on the key specifics of how the research will be conducted. 3. There are 3 basic building blocks: idea, data, tools. Your idea is a central statement that connects your research question and your motivation, and, if possible or relevant, hints at your central hypothesis. It should be a statement that provides insight into the idea as a whole. Next, you consider your data. When thinking about data, there are 2 areas to contemplate: what you need and what is possible to reasonably access or collect. With data, we can think of it as having a demand side and a supply side. On the demand side, what data do you need to answer your research problem? Is it possible to collect the data you need? What sample will be required? What sample size will be adequate, and what will be desirable? The supply side. What data are available? Is it possible to access? Who needs to supply the data, and is this viable? Are there ethical or other constraints to producing the sample? The data section of the template will help you assess the feasibility of the project, as well as highlighting issues that may need to be worked out with your research mentor before you start your data collection. Tools. Again, think about tools in terms of what you require and what is available. Think of it from the demand and supply side again. Demand side. What tests, tools do you require to answer your problem? Tools can include software programs, materials for data collection, etc. How will you access these tools? Supply side. What tools do you have access to? Are there other people or organisations that could facilitate access to tools that you require? 2. There are 2 key questions. The first question is, what's new? This is your chance to show the novelty of your project and why you're excited about it. Is it the first to achieve something? Does it solve a problem? The second question is, so what? This section is about why the research will be important to others, especially to your academic tribe. Think about the implications for the discipline and key stakeholders in the motivation section. What will change once someone reads your paper? Will they think or act differently? 1. There is one bottom line. The bottom line is contribution. Think broadly about the contribution you are trying to make to the existing research and write an overall statement that encapsulates what you hope to achieve. Other considerations. This section is for any other issues that will have a bearing on your research. What are your target journals for publication? What are the research-related risks? Is it possible someone else is already conducting your research? Are there risks associated with the research process itself, such as ethical concerns or feasibility issues? Finally, think about what role your personal assumptions and expectations could play in the outcome. Avoid designing a test that almost certainly will give you the answer that you desperately want to be true. Your approach should be objectively scientific, that is, open-minded and inquisitive, rather than aiming to confirm your personal faith. Now that we've gone through the pitch template, what can we conclude? First, the pitch template provides a simple and flexible tool to guide you through all important considerations when conceptualizing and designing a research project. Second, by taking the time to methodically work through each section and keeping within the guideline of 1,000 words, you will have all your thoughts organised succinctly for a meaningful discussion with your mentor. Remember, less is more, and by using the template, structured less is even more. Third, over time, using the template will make you a more efficient and effective researcher. You'll be able to conceptualise and define aspects of a proposed research project more quickly, giving you confidence. You'll also develop an understanding of your own research strengths and weaknesses. This knowledge will form the basis of your program of skill development. Most importantly, you will be able to optimise the time you have with your research mentor, ensuring each meeting moves your research project meaningfully forward, even when your research mentor is time poor or grumpy. For more information on the pitch template, go to the SSRN and access the latest version of pitching research at the following web address, and also the web portal pitchmyresearch.com.
We can now return to the slides, and I'm going to share the screen of the slides. Right. So this slide's showing us the vanilla version. So as I said, we have down left-hand side all the key elements, and you know, at least in as a concept, it's easy. It's easy to see what you need to do. You need to be able to write some answers against each of the items. So as a task, that's clear, but as a challenge, it's quite difficult. In fact, a lot of early career researchers find it very difficult. So what I want to try and do in the rest of the session is give you a few ideas on how you go about this difficult task. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So what this is saying is that the first four items, it's best to view them as setting the scene, as framing the big picture of what and why. So this question of why is particularly around the motivation and the key papers, because these are an indication of, I guess, the degree to which you have absorbed the literature, and that this literature is giving a context around which you are building your specific paper. Now, if you go to the next slide, this now transitions us to the first piece that is more about the specific project that you would like to do. And these are what I call the three basic building blocks. So around the specific project, it's a little bit of what, and the what is really the idea, the intellectual idea that you have, but mainly how. How are you going to, how do you plan going about your research? And the main pieces of the how are the data and the tools. But it's a combination of all three. So the data and the tools have to match the idea. Now, if we go to the next slide, we are now moving to another way of thinking of the research that you plan to do. And it's these two key questions. So the key questions that you must have good answers for are firstly to demonstrate how it's new. How does it add something new that currently isn't already in the literature? But it has to do more than that. It has to be important. And so that's what this so what question is. And these are a pair. You need to think of these as working together. It's not good enough to have a good answer for what's new, but a bad answer for so what, and vice versa. They need to work together. And then if we move to the next slide, it's really then saying to us, well, if there's one thing that you really have to show in your research, it's going to be a contribution. It's going to be an incremental contribution to the literature. Now, if we transition to the next slide, that's just going to, all right, focus our attention on, well, there are going to be other things as well. And the SSRN paper talks a lot about what these other considerations are. Given the time we've already lost, I think it's better for us to move on and leave that as a little reading exercise for you. So if you could go to the next slide, please. And in fact, we'll skip this slide as well. This one we don't need to dwell on here. in the interest of time. So
Can I
if you
move?
go to, yeah, please move to the next slide. Okay, so this slide now summarizes the themes that we have covered. Admittedly, it's been a difficult road to get to here, but it's a 2-page template. The aim is to get all your ideas down in a minimum of words, or a relatively small number of words. So I like to think of it as no more than 1,000 words across the 11 items. And the fourth dot point there is just reminding us that communication is a key objective here, that we want to communicate to an academic expert. Now, why do we want to do that? We want to do it because we desire to get technical feedback, okay, technical feedback from our academic mentor. About the middle dot point there, it's telling us that the communication is both written and oral, and a few dot points down that you should think of it as an interactive or an iterative exercise. So it's important not to think of it as a form-filling exercise. So if you were to fill out a form, how would you logically fill out a form? Well, you'd start at the top, and then you just go through item after item until you got to the bottom. Now, with this framework, while you could attempt to do it that way, I think a much more valuable way of going about it is to do it in a non-linear fashion. So you might actually start by writing out an answer to the motivation. You might start by writing down the research question. You might start by writing down the idea. What's the main idea of your research? And then you might move in a different way than just doing it linearly. And you may come back, and in fact, I think you should come back and revisit and reconsider some of your earlier answers. Because by doing this process, you naturally will develop your thinking, and it doesn't necessarily go all in the same direction, and you might have to change some of what you've written so that it works in a more cohesive manner. The third last dot point just emphasizes that you should not aim for perfection in your answers, particularly early on, because you may well find that your thinking changes, and if you've worked on perfecting an early answer, it's probably wasted effort. So get a good answer, but don't worry, at least early, about it being a perfect answer, because it's likely to change. And one way of thinking of what you're trying to do here is the second last dot point. A successful use of this framework will allow you to have an effective start of a conversation with your mentor, with your supervisor. Okay, if we could move to the next slide, please. So there's quite a number of detailed slides here, and normally I would cherry pick here and there, and that's a situation where I haven't had a lot of technical issues. We've had a huge number of technical issues tonight, so I really am going to have to flick through this quickly, but you can work through these in detail yourself. So this slide just gives a little bit of advice about the working title. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, here we have the basic research question. And a lot of there's a similar theme in some of this, and it's trying to convince you not to make it too complicated. So we look at item 10 in the middle of this slide. It says more than 3 key aspects is likely to reflect undue complexity or confusion. So if you, and I've seen it many times where a student will understand that the area is complex and want to create a research question that, just goes line after line after line, and it's a massive sentence, and it's got many many things, many aspects, many, what you might say, moving parts. And I think that's a bad strategy. So the challenge is to think, well, what are the three most important parts of the research? And then frame your research question around those parts. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so the key papers is item C. And one that I like to dwell on around key papers is item 20 on this slide. So it basically gives you some advice on what I think would be important characteristics for papers that you choose as your key papers. And these three dimensions are that the papers are very recent. So here it's asking, well, are they recent enough? Now, depending on the field that we're working in, the answer or the concept of being recent could change. Now, for many of us, probably 5 years is around about a good choice. So anything older than, if you were doing it today, anything older than a 2015 paper, I would say to you, well, I worry that that might already be seen as an outdated paper. The second piece of advice is that it's good to choose key papers that are written by well-respected and research leaders. If you choose papers that are written by researchers that are unknown, it's quite possible that the research is not of high quality. It's very likely leaders in the field are writing high quality papers, influential papers, and they should influence you. So make them recent, make them written, or choose papers that are written by research leaders in the field. And the third piece of advice is choose papers that are published in the leading journals. So for my field, and I think several of you in the audience, our field is finance. And finance, we know there are 3 tier 1 journals. Everyone agrees that they are the leading journals: Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, and the Review of Financial Studies. So I would like to see most choices of key papers that come from those 3 journals. Okay, if you can move to the next slide, please. Next slide. So if we can get off key papers. The motivation and puzzle. There's quite a few things here that are sort of pieces of advice. I talk about real world considerations. 26 advises us to try and steer clear of some very general statements about motivation. You want to state, you want to couch your motivation as something that, while being at the big picture level, is really trying to point in the direction of what your paper is going to be focusing on. So one way of thinking of the motivation is that it's partly about saying what we know that's relevant to the work you want to do. So what's the state of knowledge broadly in this field? And that then gives the second angle to the motivation, which is what are the things that are unknown that are relevant to your research? And not just all things that are unknown, but the things that you would argue we need to know. Okay, what do we know? What don't we know? And what do we need to know at a big picture level? And that will be, bringing those together in a nice way will give you a very persuasive general motivation for why your paper needs to be done. Okay, if you could transition to the next slide, please. Okay, next slide again. We'll skip this. Okay, in terms of the idea, is one question that's right at the top there is the core idea clear? Is it concise? Is it simple? Is it compelling? Is there a hypothesis or prediction? And while it's not always the case that a paper would lead to a hypothesis or prediction, I think for many of us, that is quite a likely situation, that the idea can not totally, but largely be expressed around a prediction that you have in mind. Now, if for any in the audience that do qualitative research, this won't work. Qualitative research, as far as I know, you never have a prediction, you never have a hypothesis. You're basically trying to explore in some sort of very detailed way a particular setting that you're trying to understand and learn more about, and you don't know what to expect. But as item 30 here suggests, theory is important. So there'll be elements of the basic theoretical framework that you would quite typically use to describe your idea, your research idea. Okay, if we could skip to the next slide, please. Okay, data. So, this is all part of the basic building blocks now. So, we just talked about idea. What about the data? Are the data fit for purpose? 38 says, well, make sure we are, as much as we can, using the gold standard, whatever the gold standard of data that is defined by the time in which you're doing your research. You should try and get as close to that gold standard as possible. And if you're not near that gold standard, then there needs to be a good reason why not. And as long as that reason is a good one, then what you need to have is a high quality set of data. So data that that have too much noise will be low quality. So we want to at least make sure that the data we have is has a minimal amount of noise attached to it. Okay, if we could move to the next slide, please. Okay, so that talks a little bit more about signal to noise. So that's enough on data. We'll say something about tools now. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, tools. Again, are the tools fit for purpose? So we've got a set of data. We have to analyze them in some way. We have to analyze them in a way that those in the field will see as reliable types of analysis. So again, it will be, what is the gold standard of tools in the field? And sometimes that gold standard requires quite a deal of technical skill. And item 54 here says, well, for a number of students starting out, research students, they have skill gaps. And so the supervisor can use this as a way of trying to identify what skill development might be needed in order for the application of the tools to be successful and reliable. Okay, if we could move from tools, please. Next slide, and if we could skip this slide. Okay, so what's new? So essentially, and it should make sense to you that most types of research have as a goal creating something that we don't already know. I mean, there's a whole area of replication that's important for the scientific community, but that's for another day. The discussion of that and why it's important is not of the focus of today. Today is thinking about research that will add something, and it can only add something if it's new. And we have to make some sort of call on the novelty that we're doing in our research. And number 63 on this slide drives home a very important message, and it's often one that trips early and novice researchers up, that they look for a trivial way, or they don't look for it, it just happens. They come up with a trivial way of explaining what they think is the novelty in their research. And the problem with this is that those in the experts in the field won't give this much value. And so one example of this would be to think about in finance doing a single country study. So it's quite logical that you would choose the country that you were born in, that you grow up in, that you study in. So for me, a lot of my research, especially early on, was looking at the Australian market. Now, a very trivial way of arguing that this is new and novel is to say something like, I choose Australia because this research has never been done in Australia before. Okay, it's never been done. Isn't that new and novel? Well, most of the time, it's going to be a trivial expression of newness and novelty. And the reason will be that in a lot of fields, these sorts of tests have already been done in other markets, other similar markets, other very similar markets. And typically in finance, they're done in the US market first. And those that are leading the research field will say, if we know how something works in the US, that will be a good guide for how it works in a lot of other settings, including Australia. And so the claim of novelty that says it's not been done in country X before, it's not been done in Australia before, will be a problem. Okay, it will be a problem. Okay, if you can move to the next slide, please. So what? So it's not enough to identify that something is new and novel. At least it's not going to get you too far if that's all it is, because there are a lot of things that are new and novel that people in the field don't really care about. And they'll say, well, so what? So a much stronger research project will be one that's not only new and novel, but that you have a very clear idea and a compelling argument as to why people would care. Why do we need to know the answer to this research question? And that's really what So What is challenging us to do. Okay, if you could move on to the next one, please. And the next one, we'll skip this. Okay, and in terms of the template, it's really then saying, well, the one bottom line, if you really had to express the reason for doing something, the reason for doing a piece of research with one theme or one concept, then almost everyone would say, well, it's got to be its contribution. It's got to be its incremental contribution. 75 here is saying it's got to be more than just repeating that it's new. All right, you've already said that. That's going to be part of the contribution story, but it's more than that. 76 says, well, don't just rely on what you said for So What. That can be part of it, but it's got to be more than that. And so the other items on this slide are trying to give us a feel for what a really compelling contribution will be. And it's going to be about something that leads to a new field of study. That would be a big contribution, all right? So if you write a paper that's new, it's important in its own right, and it opens the door to something that brings a lot of researchers in and a new field of study, that is a big contribution. Now, we all can't do that. In fact, there's only a few of us that will be lucky enough and smart enough and whatever to do that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that is the the thing that we're striving for in terms of contribution. It's more than novelty, it's more than importance, it's a combination of all, and it's beyond, it's opening the door to something that's beyond just the study that you're doing or you plan to do right now. Okay, if we could transition to the next slide, and in fact, we'll skip this one too. If we could skip that. Okay, so there's a discussion of other considerations here. There are things like, well, you should think about the target journal. So number 83 here is talking about the target journal. You know, is it realistic, the target journal, the journals you have in mind? Are they sufficiently ambitious? And it also talks here about research process risk. So things like, well, is the project likely to produce a result? All right. So our worst nightmare is we embark on a project and we get no result. There's nothing statistically significant. Now, of course, we won't know until we've done the research whether it does produce a result. But an experienced researcher will have a reasonably informed guess of whether a particular area or project will lead to a result or not. And so it is worth thinking about that very early on. What about competitors? Are there competitors out there that are working on similar research? So we need to think and do some searching to make sure some of the leaders in the field who have already done research related to your topic before, are they doing similar research right now? And will they be a competitor? And if they are, that's a risk that you have to worry about. And the other risk that you need to worry about is mentioned in 86 as well, and that is sometimes topics become obsolete. They can become obsolete before you finish them. So there might be a regulatory change or something that essentially means the issue that you were looking at is no longer a topical issue. So you can be unlucky. It might be very hard to forecast or predict, but it's worth thinking about that early on to think, well, is there a chance the topic that I want to research, that I want to spend 1 year researching, 2 years researching, 3 years researching, is there a chance it could become obsolete before I get it finished? Okay, so that's something on the other considerations. If we could move to the next slide, please. Okay, skip this one. Right, well, finally we've got to the end of goal one, and we've used up a lot of time due to our technical hitches, but maybe I'll pause there and we'll just see whether there are any questions from the audience at this stage. Anyone got a question? I guess if you want to type something, I can look at the chat. Or if you want to unmute and ask something. If there are no questions, we can.
Do you have any questions?
All right, well, I'll give you at least one more opportunity before we finish, but let's think about an example. Now, I've got a video. I'd like to try it. I mean, it might turn out, you know, if this doesn't work, we can abandon it. But I've got a really nice example. It's a 9-minute video. So let me just, I'm going to have to queue it up. So just bear with me, and then I'll share the screen. Right, and I'll just give you a quick introduction, and hopefully it won't be a wasted introduction, in that the video will work reasonably well. So the background to this video, it's a student that entered a competition that I've run at UQ for the last 5 years, except this year COVID defeated me. I decided to abandon it this year, but in the prior 5 years, it was a UQ-wide competition. So University of Queensland is a comprehensive university. So I think we pretty much accommodate almost every broad field that you could think of that attracts some type of academic interest and academic research. And so the example that I want to share with you is actually a medical example. And I'm guessing probably no one in the audience knows anything about medical research. But don't be put off by that. I think you'll find the topic quite interesting. In fact, it's from 2017, and this student was the runner-up of the competition. And basically her research looks at hearing difficulties in young children. So what she's going to tell us about is her research looks at a new technique of better diagnosing and understanding these hearing difficulties with young children. It's a little different to what you'd expect from a purely written pitch. Because what she is doing a PowerPoint presentation, so she won't have all the words of the pitch there, but I think you'll get a good feel as long as the audio and video quality work for us. So what I'm going to do is get this ready, and then I'll share the screen, and you'll get a good idea early on if it's going to work with Santa. If it doesn't, just yell out and we'll stop it. So let me share the screen.
Good afternoon. My name is Keris and I'm also from the HABS faculty, but the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, and I'm here to talk to you about my research entitled Using an Emerging and Innovative Technology, Wideband Acoustic Emittance, to Diagnose Conductive Pathologies in School-Aged Children. A hearing loss is caused by pathology anywhere in the ear. Conductive hearing losses are caused by a pathology or a disease of the outer or middle ear. They often go unnoticed, fluctuate in severity, and are most common in children. I'm interested in identifying and diagnosing these pathologies that result in conductive hearing loss. We're going to call them conductive pathologies. So my research question is, are wideband acoustic emittance measures able to diagnose conductive pathologies with greater accuracy than the current clinical standard? So why is this important? Studies report that up to 13% of Australian school children will fail a school hearing test on any given day. And the vast majority of these are due to a conductive pathology. The current clinical standard, conventional tympanometry, is failing to identify conductive pathologies with high accuracy. A new battery of tests, wideband acoustic emittance, has emerged as an objective test of outer and middle ear function, showing preliminary results suggesting that we can improve our ability to diagnose conductive pathologies. So far, small-scale studies have shown promising results regarding the capabilities of wideband acoustic emittance. Wideband measures were shown to be better predictors of conductive hearing loss than the current clinical standard and improved the classification of ears as normal or impaired from 76% up to 96.5% correct. Results have suggested that different conductive pathologies provide a distinct wideband acoustic emittance result pattern. And wideband measures have also been shown to identify otitis media with effusion, a common conductive pathology with high diagnostic accuracy. Conventional 226 Hz tympanometry is a quick and objective test of middle ear function. It uses a 226 Hz pure tone to measure the oral acoustic admittance, or how much sound flows into the middle ear. However, its capabilities are limited. This test can only identify two factors: the presence of fluid behind the eardrum, or if there's no fluid, the air pressure of the middle ear cavity. So currently in clinics nationally and internationally, the accepted standard can only identify a conductive pathology if there is a measurable change in the middle ear's ability to absorb and transmit a 226 Hz pure tone within these two parameters. The auditory system is built to perceive a huge array of frequencies. Conductive pathologies can also affect the middle ear's ability to function across this range of frequencies, not just those at or around 226 Hz. Wideband acoustic emittance measures are a family of physical measures that assess middle ear function using a wideband signal. So this is a signal using frequencies from 226 Hz up to 8,000. It also has the ability to detect changes in middle ear function across this range. It captures the same data as conventional tympanometry, which is that yellow dotted line there, or can be compared to that yellow dotted line there, but for all frequencies in this range. It is hypothesized that wideband acoustic emittance measures will identify conductive pathologies in school-aged children with high predictive accuracy, upwards of 90%, that they will have greater predictive accuracy than the current clinical standard in this population, and that wideband measures will accurately differentiate between specific conductive pathologies in school-aged children. To address these hypotheses, data will be collected cross-sectionally from two sets of participants. Participants from the normative data set will be recruited from students undergoing hearing assessments in Brisbane schools, and participants for the clinical data set will be recruited from patients of the audiology and ENT departments at Ipswich Hospital. All participants will undergo a comprehensive audiological test battery with changes to test protocol depending on the environment. Wideband measures will be retrieved from all participants. And participants will be included in the normative data set if they pass their hearing test provided at their school, and participants will be included in our clinical data set if they have been diagnosed with a conductive pathology by an ENT surgeon. So the results of our 226 Hz tympanometry and our wideband tests are our dependent variables and will be compared based on a clinically acceptable gold standard, and that's the diagnosis by the ENT surgeon. Age, gender, ear, ethnicity, and presence and degree of conductive hearing loss will act as an independent variable for all of our outcome measures. Small amounts of missing data are expected to occur, as is common when working with paediatric populations, but these are not expected to have any effect on our data analysis. To reach a satisfactory level of specificity and sensitivity for these tests, we need to have data from 562 ears to achieve a power of 80% and with a 5% level of significance. And this will be achieved by running a school hearing program for 3 years. All testing equipment is either on-site at Ipswich Hospital and UQ, or is transportable and calibrated prior to testing. The personnel performing these tests will be qualified audiologists or audiology students under direct supervision. The sensitivity, the statistical analysis area under the ROC curve will be used to evaluate the diagnostic accuracy of the wideband and conventional measures. The two tests can then be directly compared. Sensitivity, specificity, and likelihood ratio predictors will be calculated to further compare the performance of each test. So what's new? This study will directly compare the diagnostic accuracy of current clinical practices against this new wideband measures at identifying conductive pathologies in school-aged children. We will also use the wideband measures to diagnose the pathologies in school-aged children, which is an entirely new concept within the literature. But so what? Diagnostic accuracy is of utmost importance for best clinical practice, and the current clinical practices are not diagnosing conductive pathologies with sufficient accuracy. This study will provide critical information regarding the diagnostic accuracy of our conventional methods versus the diagnostic accuracy of an innovative technology. If the hypotheses are correct, there is potential justification to replace 226 Hz tympanometry with wideband acoustic emittance measures to improve clinical practice and in turn optimize audiological care. Additionally, if conductive pathologies are able to be diagnosed in this manner, then children will not have to undergo surgical and invasive procedures just to get a diagnosis. Direct comparison of the diagnostic accuracy of these two measures for identifying conductive pathologies in children is a novel concept, and as such, the study will fill a prominent gap in the literature. Findings from the study also have the potential to inform future research processes by allowing more accurate evaluation of middle ear function. Ethical clearance for this project has already been attained. It's a low-risk project, and all of the tests are routinely performed in health settings around the world. Collaboration with the SHRS and the Ipswich Hospital have been already organised to ensure that that the research design and that the data collection is actually possible. Also, this research provides a service to the community. Hundreds of children will receive a hearing test when otherwise they may not have access to this service. Lastly, otitis media, the most common conductive pathology, is a leading presenting childhood illness in doctors' surgeries and GP clinics nationwide, second only to the common cold. There is a great demand for research regarding how best these patients can be diagnosed, because with accurate and quick diagnosis comes the best audiological and medical management. In summary, this project seeks to assess and directly compare the diagnostic capabilities of two methods for assessing middle ear function in children: the current clinical standard, 226 Hz tympanometry, and an innovative technology, wideband acoustic emittance. The results of such research have the potential to better our ability to diagnose conductive pathologies and consequently improve the standard of clinical audiological care. Thank you.
That was obviously an example from an area that many of us don't research in, but hopefully, notwithstanding that, you can see the potential value of the tool that I've tried to take you through. Despite all the technical difficulties, I hope you've been able to tune in enough to see what the elements are, why they're there, the sort of advice and thinking around some of the choices and decisions of what they would be, and that has been enough to familiarise you sufficiently that when Keris gives her pitch of research in a medical field for school-age children that have hearing difficulties, and she's talking about a conventional test that uses a very narrow band of the audio spectrum to one of this wide band, this sort of new technology, which 3 years ago was pretty new. I guess now it's not so new. That even though we're not experts in this field, we can see how the framework has allowed her to communicate some ideas of her research, and we could sort of pretend, if you like, that we are experts in the field. So I think pretty much we've achieved the main goals. You know, I feel a little bit ragged now due to all the technical difficulties, and I do apologise for that. I suppose we could try and now round out things just to see whether there are any questions around this framework. I'm happy to take those. So,
Robert, if you go
yes.
to the chat, there is one question asked from Asita Gunasekara, is an MSc student of mine. Can you go to the chat and?
Yeah, I'm having a look at the chat now. So, will it be impossible to publish research that the idea presented by the paper is not supported by the local data of the sample due to the inherent characteristics of the local data, but it may be significant when tested for international markets? So if it reminds me of advice I got many years ago, which I think is talking to the issue that's been raised here, and it was sort of along the lines of, I had an idea, and the natural tendency was, well, I'm going to get Australian data. I'm studying in Australia. I live in Australia. I'm Australian, so I'm interested in that. And I think someone that was giving advice said to me, well, if you've got a really good idea, and this was quite harsh advice, but I understood it. If you've got a really good idea, don't waste it on Australian data. That's what's ringing in my head from all those years ago. And it was quite hard advice to take, because it was sort of like, well, almost saying that I would be wasting my time using data that was from a market that the world, and in finance, the world, whether you like it or not, revolves around the US. So another way of putting it would be, well, if you've got a good idea, use the best data in the world. And mostly, not always, but mostly, the standard in my field, in finance, is to say, well, the best data will be from the biggest capitalist market that we know, which is the US. So, so I guess the gist of your question is that, that advice I got all those years ago is saying, if you do it in a market that people aren't interested in, even if it's a good idea, it's going to be hard to sell. It's going to be really hard to sell. And, it's probably not the advice that you want to hear. It's probably not the comment that you want to hear. But I think it's sort of, it's true. Now, there is one sort of piece of good news out of this, that it is possible that in certain settings that aren't the US, there's an interesting question, research question, that can be framed and can only be answered in that setting. All right, so there's something about the US market that doesn't allow us to see a certain insight or collect certain data. It's unusual, but it's possible. And so we can see the occasional good example of this from published studies in the Journal of Finance, or in the Journal of Financial Economics, or in the Review of Financial Studies, where the researchers have used non-US data, and very early on in reading those papers, we understand why, because they will basically say, here's a really interesting question, and you cannot study this using US data for some reason, all right? And however, you can study it using this other data. Now, one broad example of this, probably over a decade ago now, was where there was a series of studies using Finnish data, so from Finland. And basically the advantage of that data at the time, and the advantage probably doesn't exist anymore, but at that time, this data was very detailed in terms of the trading, the actual trading behavior of well, they're anonymous, they were made anonymous, but you could basically get a lot of information about the people that were actually trading in the Finnish market. And this was information that was at the time only available for Finland. You could not get it in the US. And so there were a series of papers by these Finnish researchers. They were able to sell it. They were able to say, here are some interesting questions that you need to use this data for. And so if we can, it's super challenging and super difficult, but sometimes it is possible. Are there any other questions? You're welcome. I can see you thank me. So, I think...
Robert, I have a question on behalf of others. This question is based on the publications. So, and the research conferences, as you said that, as we know that once we are going to publish or present papers at the research conferences, sometimes the research ideas can be taken by others. And I have seen the good papers that they have published in a ranking journals. They haven't forwarded or presented in any kind of a conferences. So how do you look at these two? Because what we normally suggest our PhD students and master students, go to the conference and get the feedback and develop your papers. In other way, we can see some the good contribution papers never come to the conferences and straight away go to the journal. How do you answer? How do you answer this kind of a pathway?
Yeah. Well, it's obviously a tricky area, and I mean, there's a few things that we need to bear in mind. I mean, one is that it's quite possible and quite common that different researchers can simultaneously, without knowledge of each other, generally come up with the same research idea. And so there are some interesting examples in the literature where essentially the same papers can be published where they're looking at the same broad research question. They take a bit of a different angle, and it just happened. It's just coincidence. So it's, no doubt there are cases where ideas are stolen, where if you've got a good idea and someone sees it and they have a big advantage over you in terms of, they have a better access to the US data, they have better access to journal editors, they have better access to all sorts of resources, that somehow they can, steal your idea or take it and you get nothing for it. How likely is this to happen? I'm not totally convinced that it happens as much as we might think. But everyone has to make their own personal judgment, and some of us are super cautious, and I know of academics that hide their work right to the end because they really are paranoid that their ideas will be stolen. Now, the counter argument to that is if you're so secretive, no one will ever know you exist. The counter argument, one of my colleagues says, well, the risk of having someone steal your ideas is much lower than the risk that no one ever knows that you're working in a field. So there are potential benefits of getting a well-developed working paper and putting it on SSRN or having it in the public domain, and basically saying, hey, like it's almost waving a flag to the world and saying, here I am, this is a good paper, and hope that it gets recognized, and that publicity, that profile turns out to be something positive. There's no right or wrong answer, and you just have to make your mind up as to whether you're secretive and cautious and play that way, or you're confident in yourself. You go to conferences and you hope that if you've got a good idea, the paper that you develop will be one that you can publish.
Thank you very much.
I can see another question in the chat. Yes.
She's one of the PhD student of mine.
Yes. So how can we explain the contribution of study in the Sri Lankan context? Well, in any market, we all that is sort of not the US. It's going to be tougher. Partly the answer is, well, what is your objective? So I guess we need to be realistic in our objectives, and so for most of us, our objectives should be quite modest. So trying to, so if you're really ambitious, so if you're doing a study in Sri Lanka, or if I'm doing a study in Australia, and I want an international audience, I want an international editor or a journal, an international journal, the editor of the international journal, to pay attention, to sort of think, wow, that paper looks pretty good, I'd like to publish it. Well, it's about explaining, if we don't, I suppose one way of thinking of it is, if you don't use US data, you've got to have a good, and your goal is an international journal, then you need to convince an international audience that the choice of your choice of setting has merit. And if you can't convince that it has merit, that there is an economic reason, there's a research reason for choosing that setting, you're going to have a real problem, because the view will be, and it's not going to sound, what I'm about to say is not going to sound very good, but it's sort of the reality, and that they won't care about any particular setting just because you care. And we all care about our home country. We all care about our setting. I care about Australia. You would care about Sri Lanka, and no one, in the end, that's what matters. You should care about it, and some, many of the studies we do, we should have more modest goals, and there's no shame in adding to the knowledge of our local situation, but to strive to go further into the international audience, we have to be confident. We have to have a strong argument as to why. What is it about? What is it unique? If you want to choose Sri Lanka, what is unique about that financial market or that economy that would convince someone that doesn't live there that it's a good choice? It's a good choice for the question you've got in mind. Now, that is very difficult and very restrictive, because most times you won't be able to sell it in a compelling way. So what you need to do, I find, and I imagine that it'll be a small number of studies in your field that have been successful, that they've broken through and got, in finance, it could be in the Journal of Banking and Finance, for example, or the Journal of Corporate Finance. A few studies that have got into those international journals, have a really close look at them and see how, particularly, the introduction will be, the introduction section of the paper will be very instructive, because there'll be something, the line of argument and the way in which they've set it up, which basically says it's important to look at Sri Lanka for these reasons, for this topic. And so you should study those few papers that have been successful to try and figure out what the magic is. There could be an element of luck, but hopefully you can see what the magic is, and then think of, well, with your study, can you also have some magic? And the chances are it will be super tough, but sometimes you may be lucky and you may be inspired, and you'll find something that will really work, and you can sell a contribution.
Any questions from the audience? Rwangi, do you have any question? Yes, Rwangi, go ahead with that. Rangi, we can't hear your voice. Hello.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, you want to ask the question? Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes. Can you a little bit reduce the volume?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
As explained in the other considerations,
Yes.
it was a part, the last part was other considerations. So, in there, you have mentioned that if we can do an assessment, it will be better. So, can I have a brief idea of how to do it? Can you hear me?
Is that
Yeah.
question clear or what?
So I think I missed the key thing that you're asking.
Rangi, can you repeat that question?
It's to do with other considerations, and you.
It's regarding the other considerations, the last part of the presentation. So, from in there, you have mentioned a risk assessment.
Risk assessment.
Yes.
Yes.
Can you please explain, like?
Okay. So it's not a risk assessment in the way that you might normally think. It's research risk, and it's not even. So the most obvious thing you think about is if you're a medical researcher, and so you're going to test some drug. So in the case of COVID, of course, we know worldwide there's over 100 research teams that are looking to try and find a vaccine. So there the risk is quite obvious, and it's a health risk. But most of us aren't doing that type of research. But it's still a risk assessment that's required, but it's nothing for us that aren't doing health research. It's nothing to do with health. What it is trying to anticipate some research risks that you may be subject to. And I did mention these briefly already, but I'll quickly mention them again. So one of them is the no result risk. Okay. So it's basically thinking about, well, can we try and get a feel for the likelihood we will find a result when we do the test, a statistically significant result? Because if we find no statistically significant result, at least the way the research world works right now, it's really hard to publish. So that's a risk. That's a research risk. Now, we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know for sure what the outcome will be. And we won't know until we actually do the research. But the point I was trying to make earlier was that experienced researchers will have sort of a good feeling or feel for whether a particular topic is likely or more likely or less likely to find a result. And so they can give advice which will allow us to deal with that type of risk and risk assessment. The other two that I mentioned earlier was competitor risk. So all that says is, well, don't live in a bubble. Don't sort of ignore the fact that the research world is big and there's potentially a lot of competition. And so you might spend some time looking at what key researchers in this field are doing in their most recent work. So what papers are they presenting at conferences? What's on their web page around their working papers? What do they have on SSRN? So, there are leaders in the field around a topic that you're looking at. They are competitors, or they're potential competitors. Think about that as a risk that you face. And the third one that I mentioned was the risk of obsolescence, or at least the potential for us. We can pick a topic now that everyone's excited about, but will it still be exciting in 6 months' time? Will it still be something that people care about in 12 months' time. Again, we don't have a crystal ball, but if we can think of, well, are there potential things that could happen that suddenly mean this research no longer has value? So I guess a COVID example would be if you were a medical researcher today and think, oh, I've got this great idea to get a vaccine for COVID. The fact that you're 6 months or more behind the main competitors are into stage 3 trials. So if they get a solution by the end of the year and you're still doing your research, and the solution, they get a vaccine that works 90% of the time, and you haven't finished your research, suddenly it becomes obsolete. So do you want to take that risk? So that would be the examples of a risk assessment around research.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions? Any questions?
No, I think.
So if you don't have any questions, so we are going to wind up today's session. And I request one of the audience to make the vote of thanks on behalf of the contribution done by the Robert Pfaff. He spent nearly 2 hours with us, very fruitful information in relation to research. He gave us and he opened our eyes how to look at the research questions, contributions, and also very important aspect of the research. Anyone would like to thank him for his contribution from the audience? Vasuki, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, sir. On behalf of everyone who has participated to the webinar, I would like to convey our sincere thanks to Professor Robert. Hello, Professor Robert. Hello, everyone. This is greetings from Sri Lanka. Aiboan Vanakkam. On behalf of Kotalavala Defence University, Sri Lanka, all the participants to the webinar, I would like to express our sincere thank in regards to Professor Pfaff for sharing your knowledge with us about your own innovative ideas of pitching research. To be frank, it's a quite novel area for many of us. So I consider it's a great privilege to listen to a scholar who has done a great contribution to the research field and to listen to his own explanation and get more clarification directly from the scholar itself. And we listened more about his own research signature work, and it's a wonderful opportunity for all of us as researchers and academics to listen to a world-class renowned resource person. Finally, Professor Robert, we appreciate your scholarly contribution and thank you once again for giving us this time and valuable contribution to the field of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vasuki. That's
At
very
last,
kind words. Yep.
yes. At last, on behalf of Kotalavala Defence University, I would like to extend our thankfulness to Professor Vasanta Pereira for liaising, organizing, and giving us this scholarly forum. I hope the 2.5 hours we spent was an eye-opener to pitching research as a multifunctional tool. I would say it's lots of food for thought for every one of us. Thank you for all the active participants, those who have added their questions and got clarifications. It gave more chances for everyone. Those who I think even those who have not asked many questions, it's a wonderful chance for everyone. So have a pleasant day for everyone. Thank you very, very much. Stuti Nandri.